Okay, well, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to our next Fraud Prevention Network webinar. This one's entitled Due Diligence and Making Informed Credit, Risk and Procurement Decisions. My name is Laurie Beagle. I'm from Forums International, and I'll be chairing this as we go through. So to our next slide. Now we'll be looking at the top tips for due diligence and how to make informed credit risk and procurement decisions. And I'm pleased to have with me today Nigel Dickinson, Head of Partnerships at our corporate partners Graydon UK Limited, and Darren Hodder, Director of LittleGratti Limited, also a Forums International corporate partner. So the first, just to say to you, we are recording this, so we'll be able to have, that will be available in a couple of days' time. And if you've got any questions at all going along, please use the chat button at the bottom, and we'll make sure that we actually cover those towards the end of the session. So we have two sessions to start with, Nigel first, and then Darren following that. So if I can hand over to Nigel.
Thank you, Laurie, and welcome everyone to this FPN webinar. For those of you, let me just take control of the screen. Those of you who may not be familiar with Graydon, we have been around for 130 years or so. We're one of the UK's leading credit reference agencies, and sister companies in Netherlands and Belgium, and we're owned by the credit insurer Atradius, who many of you may be familiar with. So what are we hearing at the moment from our customers about what's going on in the marketplace? There's a number of things that we're regularly hearing. We're hearing from customers that perhaps the most common one is people are seeking deferred payment terms, claiming they're unable to pay. In many cases, of course, this is very genuine, but we've had a number of cases, both reported by customers and from our own experience, where companies have claimed to be not trading, but in actual fact, a bit of questioning or looking at their website, and they are trading, and when challenged, are perfectly able to pay bills. A lot of the other phenomena that we're seeing do lend themselves to fraudulent activity. So pressure to approve credit applications, uncertainty over the stability of suppliers, customers seeking higher value orders, disruptions in supply chain. There's a perfect storm here of the types of conditions that can be taken advantage of by fraudsters. Slowdown in payments, increases in fraud across the board, as measured both by our own figures, but also the figures of various governmental and non-governmental bodies, some of which I'll share with you later. And the bottom right phenomenon, the fact that winding up hearings have been postponed during the COVID crisis, is leading to more firms continuing to trade when they may be insolvent or potentially fraudulent businesses. So that's certainly one to be aware of and watch out for. We all know, of course, the challenge of working with companies' house data, and the fact that by the time those accounts are filed, then they are effectively a year out of date. That challenge is being exacerbated given that many companies are taking advantage of the allowances for delayed filing of accounts. So that issue of the information being out of date is only going to worsen as time goes on. So fraud in general remains a growing threat to UK businesses. It is an extremely fast growing industry, and it is good to consider it as that, as an industry. The people who commit the frauds are professional, sophisticated organisations, and potentially making a lot of money at our expense. We think that only 15% of the fraud that's actually committed is reported to the police, which is an issue in itself. But when you look at how many of those are actually prosecuted and result in a successful conviction, it's down to 3% of that 15%. So the fraudsters know that there is a very small chance of being reported in the first place and investigated and convicted in the second place. So the grim reality, I'm afraid, is that fraudsters are very successful, which possibly goes to explain why it is such a growth industry. Graydon estimates the level of business-to-business fraud is about 106 billion per annum. That's in the context of the higher figure of about 190 billion, which includes all of the fraud carried out against individuals as well as against corporates. And of course, all of this fraudulent activity that's going on always has painful consequences, but they go wider than might first appear. Of course, the financial consequences are the most obvious and potentially the most painful. It's a direct hit to a company's bottom line. It's a cost that some can ill afford and might even in these difficult times push companies over the edge. But also, of course, there's the reputational damage that might be caused. Some of this fraudulent activity does get into the public domain, and then it can have a significant impact on the company's brand reputation. The bigger the company, the bigger the impact, and the more important the company's brand reputation is to it, then the more pain is associated. If the victim is a regulated company, then there are various other sanctions that can apply in terms of fines or even prison sentences for directors if certain AML or financial crime regulations have been breached. And of course, all this has impact not only on the corporates that are involved, but the people within those corporates who, in the extreme case, can face fines or prison sanctions themselves. But also to the lesser end of the scale, it can be extremely career damaging to have let a fraud go under the radar. So our contention is that fraud prevention should always be a key component of the credit risk function. Identifying it before it happens is key, but there are challenges. I've already spoken about the nature of the data filed at Companies House. Companies increasingly use limited companies as vehicles, setting up bogus companies at Companies House or taking over existing company records to commit fraud. And there is less and less information available through public sources on the directors and the owners and the PSCs of businesses. Also, corporate partners in the fraud prevention network are CIFAS. They are a great example of how it helps to collaborate and share information. One of the most effective ways of combating fraud is to share your experiences, your information with other people, either in the same industry or in a group like FPN or a more formal body like CIFAS. CIFAS share data on individuals and companies. Their members give to get. So by becoming a member of CIFAS and contributing the data, you also can see the data that's already in that national fraud database. And their members include large finance companies, large telco companies, public authorities, those organisations which are best placed and perhaps most exposed to fraudulent activity. So CIFAS reports that the biggest single type of fraud which is being committed and ends up on the National Fraud Database is identity fraud. So that's creating a false identification using bogus documents. And that equally applies to a company as it does to an individual with a fake passport. So one of the things we look out for at Graydon, for instance, is companies that appear to be set up at Companies House without being genuinely trading companies. And there are certain ways that we have of spotting those. The next most experienced type of fraud, according to CIFAS, is the misuse of facility. That might be a bank account, or in the business-to-business world, that's more likely to be a credit account, which can somehow be taken over and impersonated, and, for instance, used to deliver goods to a bogus address, which are then spirited away and not paid for. Recently, we've carried out a data match between the Graydon database of companies that we regard as suspicious in some way with the actual frauds that have been seen on the CIFAS database. We've seen three things, one of which is that the incidence of misuse of facility, so that takeover of the credit account, for instance, is much higher within the Graydon database than it is in the CIFAS database. So what that means is that in our world, where we're specifically just looking at B2B, that is far and away the most common type of fraud. The second thing that we see by the data match with CIFAS is that when Graydon identifies a suspicious looking company, there's a very high correlation of the individuals behind that company also appearing on the national fraud database. So the individuals have fraud records against them. So that means it's really important when you are checking out a business to also check out the people behind it as far as you can. And the third thing we've seen is a strong correlation between the Graydon suspicious activity and then the actual frauds that end up on the national fraud database. CIFAS are in a unique position of having access to data about bogus bank accounts and mobile phones, vehicles, credit cards, etc., as well as the more traditional financial accounts, CCJs, trading performance offered by credit reference agencies. But at Graydon, by identifying companies that are reported to us by our subscribers or that we see from our own analytical work, last year we were seeing an average value just shy of £600,000 of suspected frauds every week, with an average value of £56,000 per attempted bogus transaction. What we've seen in the first half of this year is that number has absolutely jumped up. So the average value of fraudulent transaction that we were spotting last year, 56,000, in the first half of that year, of this year, it's up at 94,000. So a startling acceleration in both the volume and the value of suspicious activity that we're seeing at Graydon. And you've got to think that that is, at least in part, being driven by the COVID situation and the fraudsters taking advantage of some of those phenomena that I referred to in the first slide. Typical challenge that we see at Graydon when we're talking to our customers or potential customers about how to combat this, this type of activity, all too often we see the denial of fraud as an issue in itself. Very commonly, fraud is rolled into bad debt, and although at one level people in the operations of a business might know that they've been defrauded, when those figures are all rolled up at a corporate level, it just goes into bad debt. Bad debt tends to have a target, and if it's within targets, then perhaps it's not called out as an issue in its own right. One of the reasons for that might be that some credit insurance policies don't pay out if a deal has been proved to be a fraud, where it is paid if it's considered to be a bad debt. And you might say, well, what's the issue? And I guess the issue here is that if you're not really calling out fraud and identifying it for what it is, then you are unlikely to have the measures in place that can actually combat it and protect yourself against it. One of the other things we commonly see at Graydon is siloed approaches. And very often this is within the larger organisations. They might have a credit department and a separate fraud department, if they have one at all. If they're a regulated business, they might have a compliance function, and also within their procurement arm, they'll be carrying out checks on their suppliers. In the most efficient organisations, these processes are joined up and the resources are shared, but all too often we're seeing the same sort of checks being carried out in these siloed functions without the information being exchanged internally, never mind externally. So that can lead, of course, to duplication of effort, to gaps in knowledge, and cost inefficiencies. Very often, companies are paying twice for the same information in different functions. So for a comprehensive approach, we would recommend always that you specifically take fraud data from a credit reference agency such as Graydon, and of course, if you are a regulated business, you also need the PEP and sanctions data for those additional AML and KYC checks. A combination of those three types of information gives the full picture on a business. And so our recommendation for best practice is a shared process for all of those functions which can otherwise be operating in silos. A single data strategy, which comprises, we think best of breed is CIFAS, because they are the managers of the National Fraud Database. And they're in a unique position to share that fraud information. Credit Reference Agency, and at Graydon we have great experience in combating fraud, as well as providing credit reference data, and then coupled with PEPs and sanctions data, with processes to share the information across the relevant functions. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but I would like to just point out, we are at Graydon launching a service that does combine all these different data elements and processes in one service. We will be launching it later this month, and hopefully showcasing that at the next full meeting of the FPN, which will be in September. So I'd love to talk to you more about that, if that is of interest. In the interest of time, we're going to go straight to Darren and not take questions now, but hold on to your questions at the end, and we'll cover them then. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have a few questions piling up, but we'll actually, as you say, we'll do those towards the end. So, okay, over to you, Darren.
Okay, thank you. That's really useful, and it does tie in very nicely with what I'm going to be talking about today as well. So, Nigel's mentioned the various different fraud risks that we're facing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of due diligence that you might want to undertake, and have a bit of a case study, which will reveal a few interesting things, I hope. Just a little bit about myself. I've been working in fraud risk management for just over 20 years now. I have a credit bureau background, and I have been working with Laurie for a number of years now to help out on the various forums that he runs, and in particular looking at the moment at how we can share best practice and share intelligence for the members of the Fraud Prevention Network. So due diligence, why would you want to carry it out, and when would you want to carry it out? Well, in my mind, there are a number of different potential scenarios that could give you cause to want to carry out some level of due diligence, either against an individual or against an organisation, or both. It might be that you have a new customer or a new supplier, and you want to be able to check the risk of working with that new customer or new. You may have a new employee and you want to verify and do some background checks that the employee is trustworthy. Perhaps there has been a significant change within an existing business relationship, and you want to verify that those changes are genuine and not fraudulent. Maybe there's been a change or a request of an increased line of credit, and that brings you into a higher risk situation, and therefore you may want to revisit any checks that you may have done in the past, maybe go into a little bit more detail. Or it might be because you have a new business partnership, or indeed you might just spot some unusual behaviour within what's happening between your customers and your suppliers, and that might cause you to want to carry out some extra due diligence. Nigel mentioned a number of data sources, and some of those I'll touch upon or will overlap with as well. But there are a number of different reasons for doing due diligence as well. So it's, as I mentioned, it's identity verification, and as Nigel pointed out, it's not just personal identity, but also corporate identity, company verification, creditworthiness. Those are all important checks for anti-money laundering and KYC compliance. You may want to do some extra checks on the persons with significant control within any one business. So that would be the other directors and any significant shareholders. And you may want to take a look at any associations and connections that have been made, and whether there's been any adverse media. So that covers a very, very broad range, and it can go into a lot of depth. So how much due diligence should you apply in any one situation? And that really all depends on the level of risk that you're going to be taking for any particular piece of business that you're going to be transacting with. You may have your own risk appetite, which may determine how deep you want to do your due diligence. You may be a regulated business, in which case you'll be mandated to do a certain amount of due diligence for anti-money laundering purposes. So I'd say it's always a judgment call, depending on the level of risk for a particular relationship, the value of any particular transaction or set of transactions, and a little bit down to your own risk appetite as well. So we're going to take a little scenario and case study, and unfortunately our friends at Forums International are going to be under the scrutiny for this case study. Laurie has not even seen this yet, so I hope there's not too many surprises that are going to be coming up. But let's say, for example, that we are in discussion, my company is in discussion to have a new joint venture and to develop and launch a new product, which is actually not too far from the truth. This is kind of what is happening within the fraud prevention network at the moment. So for me, as in making my due diligence against Laurie and his company, what sort of due diligence steps should I take? Well, given that it's going to be quite a close relationship and the product in question involves sensitive data, I want to be absolutely sure that I'm dealing with a trustworthy and legitimate company. So I am actually going to go all out and do a full range of checks. So I'm going to do some individual checks against Laurie as an individual, and he has given me permission to do some identity checks. He's given me a copy of his passport. I'm going to do a full range of company checks, look at the trading status of Forums International, look at the other directors and persons of significant control, and look at the whole company history. And again, that will also include anti-money laundering checks. And I'm going to do some media investigations as well to make sure there's no adverse media. And then very finally, I'm actually going to go all out on some additional deeper checks that you would not necessarily do for a day-to-day transaction, but for very important relationships you might want to consider doing. So I requested that Laurie give me his name, date of birth, his home address, as well as his details for his company, Forums International. So this is the information that Laurie has supplied to me, and to spare his blushes, I've omitted his date of birth, other than the fact he was born sometime in the 1900s.
Thank you for that.
I think if he'd been born after 2000, then I'd be a little bit concerned. And of course, he's given me the company trading and registered address for Forums International and the company number. He's given me a scan of the passport, but again, to save his blushes, I've blurred it out there. So, but what I'm going to do with the passport information is I'm going to run it through a verification check to make sure that it is legitimate, and I also have experience of how a genuine passport should look. So, first of all, the identity checks. I have access to a number of different credit bureaus, business and personal credit bureaus. I have verified Laurie's personal information, but I've kind of set him up for a fail here because I should have asked him for 2 pieces of identification. I only got his passport, which doesn't give me his home address. So, although it says failed here, what that really means is, for anti-money laundering purposes, I've not seen 2 proofs of identity, one of which should be a photo ID, which was the passport, and another one which must give a verification of his current address. So, if I was a regulated business, I would at this point be going back to Laurie saying, oh, actually, we also need to see a copy of a proof of address, which might be a recent utility bill, a recent bank statement, or some other form of ID that shows his address. I also happen to know that he's recently moved address as well, so he's been at his current address for less than 3 years. And so best practice would also dictate that I should also collect his previous address history for a period of a minimum of 3 years. I have matched up his current address though via the credit header from the credit bureaus, so that is a pass. I'm fairly confident I've got the correct home address for him. It's also matched his date of birth as well. I just haven't seen that second piece of identity documentation. I've also not managed to check him against the electoral roll, either because he's not registered at his new address yet, or because he's opted out of the edited electoral roll. So I put that there as a pass, but with a minor warning. So that's his identity. I've also gone a little bit further. I thought, okay, well, does he live somewhere reputable? Is this a genuine address? And he has moved very recently. It's so recent, in fact, when I went on to Google Street View, it's not been refreshed since the property had been built. So it shows me a nice coming soon situation on the left side. But on the satellite image, I can see that yes, there has been a development there, and it looks to be a nice residential property. Obviously, with some ongoing development there for the expansion of what looks to be a new little community that's being built up. So I'm fairly confident that I'm dealing with a genuine person, but I'm also going to run him through a bunch of checks for anti-money laundering and for Know Your Customer. And this would include checks against PEPs databases. So is he a politically exposed person? No, he isn't. Is he on any known sanctions? No, there's no matches there either, so I'm quite happy with that. There's been no disqualifications of directorships or any insolvencies. So I'm very happy with my anti-money laundering checks in that respect. Moving on to his company, the registered address is 1 High Street in Guildford, Surrey. When I have a look at this, I see that it appears to be an accountancy firm. In some occasions, you do see many businesses registered to the same address, and occasionally that can be an alert, but also it's quite legitimate that you'd have your address registered to an accountant, and that's the case for Forums International. I can see the company structure. I've gone onto Company's House and onto the credit bureau information for the company. So I can see that they are actively trading. The particular credit bureau that I'm using have given the company a credit score of 80, with a credit limit of 7,500. There's no bad debts associated with Laurie's company, no CCJs. In terms of looking at the overall company structure, there aren't any subsidiary companies or sister companies. It is the ultimate holding company. Sometimes when you have a relationship with a new organization, the picture can be a lot more complicated. It sometimes is useful to understand what that overall set of companies look like and what that overall structure looks like, because that can highlight some risks in of itself. And again, I've already done some KYC and AML checks against Laurie as an individual, but I've also run it against Forums International as a company, because there are both individuals and companies that can appear on sanctions registers and on various negative databases. And again, we've got a good set of results there. There's no matches that I need to be concerned about. Looking at what media is out there, I have access to a number of sources that can look across the internet to find if there's any adverse media or indeed positive media. And I've identified a few articles where Laurie and Forums International has been mentioned. And so it's all positive stuff. It kind of reconfirms to me that he is in the business that he claims to be within. So here we've got an article that he's written for the Chartered Institute of Credit Management. There's another one here that relates to a press release from Graydon about their partnership, so that gives me further confidence. And another one where there's a podcast on the Co-Credo website. So that's all good news as well. I'm all happy with that. So my basic due diligence is completely passed, albeit without having seen a second piece of identification for his home address. But to be honest, in my situation, I'm not too worried about that. So it's all a good pass so far. But if I wanted to go a bit deeper and maybe just check out a few other things to have the belts and braces there, then I might want to look at and examine the other persons of significant control within the organisation, of which for Forums International, there's one other director, and that's Lynn. And again, to save her blushes, I've also omitted her date of birth. She has no other current or previous directorships. As I mentioned, the company address is at an accountancy firm, which I've identified as being Whittington's. There are at least 14 other companies that are registered there, but I've done a bit of verification against Whittington's to make sure that they are a genuine accountancy firm, and I've verified that via the ICAEW website, so I found the firm is actually registered there and it is a chartered accountant. So that gives me greater confidence again for that trading address. Looking a bit more at Laurie's history, he has been a director of a company in the past, and he's director of a company that's been dissolved. One is CI Services, so I pulled out there the other directors, because that can sometimes be interesting to see the relationships between different people that might reveal some interconnection, give me some cause for concern. But actually, these are familiar people to me. The sole shareholder of CICM Services Limited is the Chartered Institute of Credit Management, so that's a very simple structure. The dissolved company is, I assume, what it used before it became, before it got so I can see the relationship there. I can see Laurie's history. It seems to be reasonable. But the credit bureau that I was using also identified 4 potential other dissolved companies where there was a similar and the same name and month and year of birth. So verify whether this is actually you or someone with a very similar name to you. But going further back into the past, Professional Images and Creative Services Limited, PIC Services Limited, and a couple of other companies that have long in history been dissolved. Do you recognise those, Laurie, or are they a false positive?
No, I recognise them all.
You recognise? There's no hiding. Other checks that I've done, I've decided to go into the Gazette just to see if there's any negative information there. I couldn't find anything negative. Since I'm dealing with a project that is going to deal with sensitive data, I thought I'd better check that is actually registered with the ICO, and I've got that verification. The contact details match, so I'm quite happy with that. And there are various other registers that that I could go on to. One example is the FCA register for persons that have controlled positions in FCA regulated businesses. Laurie doesn't have any history of maybe other registers that I could also go to just to really verify in detail that I really am dealing with a trustworthy guy here. And the good news is that the summary of assessments overall is that everything is a pass, albeit with one or two very minor issues to consider. So my conclusion for working with Laurie is good thumbs up.
Good, I can undo my fingers now.
Now, this is something that I now offer, and this is a brand new service. I offer this as a service to other organizations. So if you don't have access to the relevant data sources, or maybe you don't have the capability or the bandwidth to do some due diligence, then I can actually offer this as a service, and I'll be giving Laurie this report that today's presentation has been based upon. So it is financial background to Forums International, and goes into a little bit more detail than what I've shown on the slides today as to all the checks and assessments that have been done. So that is something that I'm kind of in a beta phase at the moment. So if anybody would find that useful and would like me to conduct some checks, then I'm more than happy to have a discussion around that and see how we can be of assistance to you. But I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour as to the different types of due diligence that can be done. But as I say, it's very much down to you as a business or as an organisation to determine how deep you want to do checks and at what point in any customer life cycle or journey you want to do those checks. A little comical cartoon, since we're all still in lockdown, we're various stages of coming out of lockdown. So I'd just like to thank Forums International and Laurie for inviting me to speak today. And I hope you all stay safe throughout the summer and the rest of the challenging times that we find ourselves in. Feel free to contact me anytime, and I'll hand over back to Laurie.
Thank you very much indeed, Darren, and thank you for not embarrassing me too much. So that's. I suggest what we do. We've got a couple of questions. Let's do those questions now, and then I'll just finish off with just a little bit of an overview of the Fraud Prevention Network. There's a one from Derek Barnett. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. Credit insurer's approach to a claim involving fraud will depend on whether the fraud was company impersonation or based on a company fraudulently created at company's house. If the latter, a credit insurance claim might well be payable. So, piece of information, I think, more than anything else. So, another question. This is for Nigel, actually. Do you think? What do you think is driving the increased levels of corporate fraud today?
Thank you, Laurie. I think it's the grim reality is that fraud is a very successful industry, and the more successful an industry is, then the more people in it want to grow their businesses, and the more new entrants you get into that industry, and that applies just as much to an illegitimate industry like fraud as it does to a legitimate industry. I think it's becoming increasingly known that the detection rates and the conviction rates are extremely low for understandable reasons. The police and the law enforcement agencies have got so much on their plate, and they're bound to concentrate more on the violent crimes and the crimes committed by deception. But it is creating the climate for growth, and don't see that tailing off anytime soon. So I think it really is important for people protect themselves rather than expect to be protected by the authorities, I'm afraid.
No, I think it's a very good message, that, actually. So, yeah. One for you, Darren. And what is the average loss due to invoice fraud? Now, I wish we had polling set up today, because then we actually could ask the attendees for their views of this. I'm going to say £5,000. So
well, that's a little bit of an
underestimate. No idea. So.
Does anyone want to hazard a guess within the chat? And
so the average loss to invoice fraud. Nigel, you got any ideas? Any thoughts?
Okay, well, there is a very good report that comes, an annual report that comes from UK Finance, which is the trade body for UK banks and for money transactions. And they highlighted in the 2019 report that invoice fraud averaged just over 28,000 per incident. And so what I am trying to tackle and in collaboration with Laurie is to give out as much information and educational resources as possible, but look for ways that we can collaborate and try to find ways that we can reduce this, or at least reduce the risk of being hit. So that's something that we're very active with in the Fraud Prevention Network right now. We're looking at potential methods for sharing intelligence around this kind of fraud and other B2B fraud.
Right. Well, thank you. I'm just going to pose a question. I'll come back to it at the end to see the participants, to see whether you've got any thoughts on this. What are you seeing as the most, I put the word popular, but active fraud type at the moment? So just have a think about that and see whether you've got any thoughts of that. I'm just going to run through a couple of slides on the Fraud Prevention Network. We kicked this off in May 2019. Our partners are Graydon and CIFAS, and of course at the moment all our meetings are virtual, so it's a quarterly meeting, but it's via Zoom. I think Nigel has also used the same expression as I do, is fraud is the fastest growing industry, and also fraudster seems to be one step ahead, and I'm sure that COVID-19 has probably helped them along the way on that a bit. And our aim is to change the pattern through education and support using the FPN. We'd like FPN to be seen as the go-to place when members need help. So, you know, 24/7. So, objectives and benefits. It is aimed at the B2B community. It's there to prevent, to help assist the members in the prevention, reduction and losses caused by criminal activity. We realise that we're never going to achieve 100%, but any reduction, I'm sure, will be most welcome. We want to draw on other members' experiences and knowledge, develop and enhance best and new anti-fraud practices, improve the skill levels of the members and their teams, and provide an access to like-minded professionals and relevant industry experts. So there's always somebody to go to, and the open door will be the FPN. So who's it for? FPN is for professionals of all levels who have responsibility for fraud prevention in their company. It's for cross-industry in the UK, and we're looking to extend that into Europe as well. Only people are not allowed to, or we don't welcome, our suppliers. This is for practicing credit and fraud professionals only. So. Just to run through the subscription package quickly, we meet quarterly, but we also run intermediate to that. We do 4 webinars a year as well. You have access to the Graydon Fraud Hotline, information intelligence sharing, which Darren was mentioning earlier, which we're working on at the moment. And we're pleased to say we've got some members as part of our working party helping us with that. You get discounts on Graydon's fraud investigations. Access to the Forums International website, which has got a wealth of information on as well, and access to a secure members communication area, which is called Info Hub, which will be is being redeveloped at the moment and will be live in a couple of weeks' time. Agendas are based very, very much on what the topics that the members have asked for, so it's always relevant and it's time critical. And on the agendas we have external speakers, Graydon presentation with case studies, SciFS update, but we also try and make them interactive as possible, and we've got a really interesting speaker at the next one in September, and who's going to be talking about identity fraud, and a Russian lady, so whose name I always struggle with. So, okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So, more than just 4 meetings a year, it's a series of meetings, but we're developing into a community, provide a vehicle for members to gain the skills and address the current and future challenges in fraud prevention and detection, and that picture's moving all the time, as we all know, and to develop new and best practice. Okay, I think we're almost there. So membership allows for 2 representatives to attend from each company. As I say, normally we would meet, if we're back to face-to-face, and hopefully we will be back in 2021. But and when we do, we will be back holding the meetings at SciFS offices in the centre of London. But in the current environment, we're using our friend Mr. Zoom. So, and if you're a CICM member, you actually can claim CPD points or hours. Next meeting is 17th of September, and we're offering a summer discount of 10% if you join the FPN. So if you want more details of that, please contact me. So. Okay, I think. Okay, so let's come back to my questions. So, somebody's. It's Derek Barnett and Derek Barnett, I think. Bogus company information filed at company's house, rated by credit information providers and credit insurers, and used to create lines of credit, all based on bogus financial information, none of which is audited and checked by company's house. I think that's a fair assessment, Nigel, isn't it? So
yes, I've just responded to that, but yeah, that is absolutely right. Yeah. Company's house will say that they're there to register information rather than check information, which of course legally is correct. But the company's house consultation that was kicked off last year does seek to expand their powers to be more of an investigator of the information that's filed, but that whole process has been slowed down due to Brexit at the end of last year and now COVID. Yeah. Seems to be going in the right direction, but very slowly.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure what the answer to the question is really, and you see is the most popular identity fraud and mixed in with cyber. Seems to be very, very active at the moment, and as I say, we're covering lots of that.
There is a surge in phishing at the moment because of the fact that we're all adapting our processes and working remotely. So this is phishing often targeted at people in finance or impersonation of the CEO to enable push payments. So that's when you receive an urgent email from your CEO, and it looks like it's from your CEO, saying we need to make a money transfer really quickly. here are the account details, off you go.
And we have some real life examples of that, which has happened to some of our forum members. One was, I won't actually mention the companies, but one was for £32,000, and a couple were for a bit smaller than that. And then we heard of one which was for $2 million. So interesting. So, okay, I think there's one last slide. There is. So all I'd say is, on behalf of Darren and Nigel, I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. We have recorded it, so it will be available in a couple of days' time. So so you can have a look again. If you want to contact any of us, please do, about the FPN membership or anything else that's been spoken about today. Please get in touch. And I think the message is, be vigilant, don't drop your guard. Make sure you're prepared, and in today's environment, be safe